Good morning, everyone, and welcome to what is the second in a three-part series of employability webinars. My name is Matt Higgins. I'm from Barratt Developments, and today's session is all about researching a company and kind of understanding what that company might be looking for should you wish to apply or show some interest in that organisation. My role at Barratt Developments is Employer Brand and Development Manager. So, as I've said on the first session, what that means is I get involved in all of the fantastic things around careers, early careers especially, and really highlighting why Barratt Developments is such a fantastic place to work, especially within the house building industry. As I said before, this is the second in a three-part employability series that we're running. The first part you may have already seen was all around CV writing, so how to create and prepare your CV so that you're in a really good position should you wish to apply for a role that you see. Today is all about how to research an organization. So kind of understanding, as I said, what an organization might be looking for, what might be important to that organization, so that should you get through to an assessment process, you feel ready and prepared to answer any questions that might get thrown your way. And I suppose more importantly, understand whether the company is right for you. And the final part that you'll see in the future, hopefully, is all about how to prepare for an interview and assessment. So there is some common threads that run through all of this employability series, but certainly each of those sessions has some nuggets of information that's going to be unique. So we'd definitely recommend looking out for part three if you haven't seen it already. Today's session will cover four main aspects. So the first being why you should research companies. So kind of what's the point? Why should we look into these organizations before we kind of take any steps towards maybe being employed there? From there, we'll look at where you should look for relevant information, what to look out for specifically, and then really importantly, how to use that information moving forwards. So, starting off with why you should research companies. Ultimately, if you're potentially interested in applying for a job, if you want to understand what information is out there, whether a company might be of interest to you, ultimately, if you're looking to kind of pursue a career in a particular industry, then it really, really does make a lot of sense to understand what the companies are all about, what is important to those organizations, what's happening within those organizations, and really finding out anything and everything you can about them. There's not lots of really good reasons why you might want to do that. First of all, if you are going to be writing a cover letter or filling out an application form for a particular organization, then you'll probably want to understand a bit about what they might be looking for from a specific candidate. Now, some of that information will be available on a job advert or a job description or person specification, but actually, what you'll often find is that an awful lot of information about that company that's relevant to an application process can be found more broadly, whether it be on the company website or other sources that I'll be talking about in a little bit of time. And that's more than just specifically what they're looking for from a candidate for that particular job, but ultimately what's really important to the organization and some of the values and kind of areas of importance that you might want to align yourself with so that you can be really appealing to that organization. And likewise, making sure that they align with your values as well. Obviously, within that, it's really important to kind of understand this information for an interview or an assessment process. And again, by doing a bit of research on an organization, you might find that you're more prepared to answer interview questions that are relevant to some of those areas of the company that you might have researched. Likewise, with an assessment process, you may recognize that there are certain skills or points of experience that you want to highlight more or less, depending on what you find out about that organization. But also, really importantly, when it comes to an interview process, it's actually might give you or arm you with questions of your own that you want to bring to that interview so that you can do a little bit more digging to understand whether or not this is the right company for you, or really whether actually just to find out a little bit more information that might sort of prepare you for your future potentially with that organization. One thing I think is really important, and we'll talk about this on the final session of our employability series, is that interview should be a two-way process, and it's absolutely appropriate and often looked upon quite favourably if you come armed with some questions of your own. And I think doing a bit of research around companies can really support that process. Finally, as I've said before, and I will link back to this a few times during today's session, it's to make sure that actually this is a company that you want to work for. I think a lot of people get a little bit blinkered when they go into a recruitment process and often think it's all about impressing the company that they are applying for. The reality is any interview process, any recruitment process should be two ways. So not only is it an opportunity for the organization to understand whether you are someone they want within their organization, but it's also a really good opportunity for you to work out whether it's a company that you want to work for. So do their values align with your values? Does the working environment and the culture of the organization seem like it would work for you? What about the team? What about the things that the company considers really important within house building? For example, you'll see an awful lot of house builders, Barratt chiefly among them, talking about issues like sustainability as being really, really important. So if that's something that you consider to be important for yourself, then you might think, well, actually, maybe Barratt Developments is a company that aligns with my values and I may be more interested in working for. Without doing research into organizations, you won't necessarily know that. So you could be going in a bit blind and not sure exactly what kind of organization you're stepping into. In terms of where to look for this information, there are a really wide range of sources. And when I speak to candidates, often they can be a little bit narrow in the search that they take or where they look for this information. So generally, starting at the top there, that's kind of where we're going to see most people initially looking for company information. And that's going to be on the company website, or if they've got a separate careers website, their careers website. Now, of course, these are really good first places to look because generally this will give you a great shop window into what the company is all about, what it considers important, what it looks for in candidates, what kinds of jobs are available and what is involved within those jobs if we're looking on a careers website, but also will be a repository for all sorts of information, some of which I'll talk about in just a second, including things like annual reports, PR statements, so on and so forth, particularly if we're talking about the overall career company websites. Um, Importantly as well, though, is actually looking at social media channels for the company. And often you might get a slightly different tone in those social media channels and more up-to-date, relevant information around what's going on at that time within the organization. So if a company has won an award for something recently, you'll often see that on their social media channels. If they've been doing some fantastic charity work or getting involved with projects that are particularly interesting, often that may well be on those social media channels as a slightly more kind of up-to-date stream of information that's perhaps a little bit less curated or filtered than maybe their company or careers website might be. One website that you may or may not have heard of is Glassdoor. Glassdoor essentially is like TripAdvisor, but for companies. So employees, ex-employees, or people who've gone through an interview process can essentially leave a review for a company to give some insight into what that company's like to either work for or potentially to interview for, as well as give information around salary, what interview questions you might potentially expect, so on and so forth. Now, this is a really great website to understand, again, general perception of that organization from current, previous, and prospective employees. And actually, the higher the rating on Glassdoor, generally that means you're likely to be going into a better organization. Now, this gives information on all sorts of factors about the company. So not just how good it is generally, but things like compensation, benefits, diversity and inclusion, the management structure, all of those things. It will give information as to how good those are perceived as being, and can be a really useful one-stop shop if you're interested in potentially working for a company because it tells you an awful lot about them, not necessarily from the company themselves. It's more about individual perceptions, which I think is really helpful and potentially a little bit more honest in some cases. One thing that you might naturally stumble across, particularly if you're looking at social media channels, are things like PR statements, so public relations statements, and web articles about a particular company. You could also extend this into newspaper articles if you see that occasionally, but most things are on the web these days. And again, these are going to be kind of curated information about the organization, often promoting a particular thing that they've done or been engaged with. And generally, these are going to be positive sort of stories about an organization, but not necessarily always. And again, this is particularly helpful because it gives you some insight into what's going on with that organization, what they might be involved in, potentially even outside of their kind of direct purpose as an organization. So, for example, with Barratt Developments, we do an awful lot of work for charity, and often you may see PR statements or articles about some of that charity work. Annual reports are Potentially quite a lot of heavy information to read through, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading from front cover to back cover, to get a good understanding of the organization, mainly because a lot of the information contained within annual reports might be financial information that you may not be familiar with. But you will find that an annual report will give some kind of more anecdotal information around what's happening within the company, what might be being prioritized, what might be being less prioritized, how the general industry is doing, and how the organization is operating within that industry. And just reading a few snippets from that, the elements that maybe you understand or that kind of grab your attention could be really helpful going into an interview process to give a bit of insight and show that actually you've done your wider research and you understand kind of the economic environment that an organization is operating within. Finally, one that you may not have thought about is actually thinking about competitor websites and information around competitors. So whilst that may not be directly relevant to understand whether, the company that you're applying for is right for you, what you will understand is how it compares to the wider competition. So is it doing anything particularly good or particularly bad in comparison to its key competitors? Is it an industry leader or maybe not in certain cases? Is it doing anything particularly different to the competition? And that information is really helpful because A, in an interview process, it will really show that you've done your wider research, but also it gives you an opportunity to talk about things that the company might be missing or could be doing, which again shows that you might bring ideas to an organization to help drive their success moving forwards, which obviously is really helpful in an interview or an assessment process. In terms of what to look out for, there are a few areas that you might want to consider and maybe jot some bullet points down when you're researching your company. So one is just general key information about the company. So that could be what they do, if you're not overly familiar with the industry or the specifics of how they operate. Who are their target customers? Because that's going to be really important for you to sort of drive success for that organization. What's really important for the company or to the company. And you may want to do a bit of research around that company's history as well. Where have they come from? Where are they going? Values and culture is one that's likely to be almost most important to you from a personal perspective. So that's really about what does the company stand for? What do they consider important? And that's generally going to be in relation to its customers and to its people. Ultimately, when you're doing this research, this is a really great opportunity to think, does this align with my own personal values? You know, if I think in a particular way, if I hold certain principles or values really strongly, does this company align with those or not? And that may have a really significant impact on whether or not you choose to work for a company. Um, You'll also want to look out for recent trends and new developments within the business. And I think that's certainly where things like those PR statements and web articles can be quite helpful, just so that you have your finger on the pulse as to what's going on at the moment and show that you've done your research when you are in an interview or an assessment process. Within the careers website and the job application and the job description, you'll probably be looking out for what are they looking for from their employees. So what do they expect in terms of what you would give as an employee? Are there any skills or elements of experience that are going to be particularly important? Obviously, if you highlight those, then you'll want to make sure that you can demonstrate them where it's appropriate. And really importantly, again, is what challenges might the business be facing, but also what could be going really well for that organization. And again, that's a really useful opportunity, A, to maybe give some ideas or demonstrate your understanding of that. But it could also be a great opportunity to ask some questions in an interview process or an assessment process, about an area that the organization may be doing particularly well in or maybe struggling with. Again, it shows that wider, bigger picture understanding. It shows that focus on the future as well and really developing. Finally, we'll look at sort of how to use this information. So this really links back to the CV writing and also links forward to the next employability webinar, which is all around interview and assessment skills. But generally, what you'll be using this information for is tailoring your CV. So making sure that if you are able to understand any skills or experience or elements they might be looking for from a particular employee, that where it's appropriate to you, you make sure you're demonstrating that within your CV so that you're aligning with the expectations of the job or the expectations of the company as a whole. Likewise, within your cover letter, you'll want to show a broader awareness of the organisation. So not only is the cover letter an opportunity to talk about your skills and experience, but also it's an opportunity to show your knowledge of the organisation that you've been researching as well, and hopefully demonstrate why you feel you'd be a really good fit for that organisation. A lot of application forms have specific questions that you may need to answer outside of just providing your relevant kind of employment history or education or kind of personal details. So you may find doing this research is really helpful in answering specific applications. A really common one you will see is, why do you want to work for this organization? It's very difficult to answer that if you don't know a little bit about the company. So making sure that you do your research can make that a much easier question to respond to. Likewise, same with assessment responses as well. So if you go through an assessment process, you'll want to make sure that you understand enough about the organisation that your responses to that assessment align with hopefully what they're looking for. One thing that we do within Barratt Developments is something called a situational judgment test within some of our recruitment processes. And this test essentially is to understand whether or not your behaviors, the things that you would do when presented with certain situations, aligns with what we would hope an employee would do within the company. Now, whilst doing research on our careers website, for example, doesn't give you the answers to that, it certainly gives you an understanding of what we'd be looking for from a successful employee, and hopefully helps you lean towards the correct responses in those situational judgment test questions, so that actually you can demonstrate that actually you'd be a really good fit for Barratt Developments, as an example. Very much the same principle with interviews as well. Generally, an interview process is to understand a bit more about your skills and experience, but also your behaviors as well. How would you react in certain situations? What would you do? What would you consider important? And ultimately, if you're aligning that with what an organization considers important, you're probably in a really good spot. And as I've said before many times, finally, it's really to decide if this company is the place for you. And hopefully the answer to that will be yes. But certainly this is the first point of self-selection when it comes to applying for or deciding whether you want to work for an organization. Overall, that brings us to the end of this short bite-sized session. Thank you very much for listening. If you wanted to find out a bit more about Barratt Developments as an employer, a bit more about our company, then please do visit our careers website, www.barrattcareers.co.uk, and hopefully we might be hearing from you in the future. Thank you very much.